A while back, Yankees GM and senior VP Brian Cashman made a couple of comments that got some attention. When he was asked by the Athletics' Andy McCullough about the team not winning a World Series since 2009, Cashman got a little defensive. He told McCullough that, in his mind, the Yankees weren't in a drought at all, and in fact would have been in a position to win a title in 2017 had they not been interrupted by something, quote, illegal and horrific. Now, to me, Cashman's comments came across as a little sour grapesy, and didn't really address the other 10-plus years that the Yankees haven't won anything. But at least to a certain extent, he did have a point. In 2017, the Yankees won 91 games and made the playoffs, but were knocked out of the ALCS in 70 games by the Astros, who went on to win the World Series, and also went on to get caught cheating to such an extent that it got their manager and GM both fired. Coincidentally, the same thing happened 2 years later to the Yankees on a walk-off home run by José Altuve, who became one of the most important figures in the Astros scandal and was right in the middle of the whole Buzzergate conspiracy thing. I think Cashman's right to still have a little beef with the Astros, but even 3 years after the story broke, he is far from the only one with a grudge against that team. According to a recent survey conducted using Twitter data, the Astros are the third most hated team in baseball, right behind the Dodgers and, of course, the Yankees. There's a certain irony in Brian Cashman being the messenger for telling everyone how much the Astros suck, but that's kind of beside the point. The Astros scandal rocked baseball. It cost them draft picks, several people ended up losing their jobs, and most of all, it put a black mark on a sport that cares a lot about its integrity. Major League Baseball is still feeling the effects of that cheating operation that started all the way back in 2017, mostly in how people feel towards the team that carried it out. But what I want to know is, after all this time, should we care that the Astros cheated? Like, seriously, I'm asking, what does it matter? Should we have ever cared? It's kind of a loaded question, but to me, the answer is pretty clearly yes. We should absolutely care that the Astros cheated, but not for the reasons you think. In case you forgot the ins and outs of what the Astros got in trouble for, let me give you a quick recap. After pulling off one of the most impressive rebuilds I've ever seen, like they went from losing 100-plus games 3 years in a row to winning 100 in 3 years, the Astros were one of the best teams in baseball. All of the guys they'd spent that time developing, Springer, Correa, Bregman, Altuve, they were all coming good at just the right time. The Astros won their division at an absolute canter and brushed aside the Red Sox in the division series to create a matchup with the aforementioned Yankees in the ALCS. And as Brian Cashman was kind enough to point out, they did pretty well there too. The Astros won all 4 of their games at home to beat the Yankees and advance to the World Series, which they also won in 7 games against the Dodgers. It was the first title in franchise history, and with the young core of stars and a promising manager, the Astros looked ready to take over baseball for the foreseeable future. And that's really where the story of that season should have stopped. But it wasn't. We wouldn't really find out about much of this until a couple years later, but in September of that World Series season, White Sox reliever Danny Farquhar noticed something strange. In one of his relief appearances in Houston, he kept hearing a weird noise when his catcher called for an off-speed pitch. Every time a changeup was called, the sign would go down and he'd hear the same sound, which he said sounded like a bat hitting a bat rack. Then, about a year later, the A's noticed something similar happening. One of the Astros' former pitchers, a guy named Mike Fiers, who might be more famous for his shaving choices than his pitching ability, had been traded to the A's earlier in the season. He's going to become important in a couple of minutes, so just hold on to that name. But in September 2018, the A's filed an official complaint with MLB, claiming that the Astros had stolen their signs, and were clapping from the dugout to communicate them to whoever was in the box. Then a month later, it was the Indians and Red Sox comparing notes on the Astros' alleged shenanigans. Evidence was starting to mount that there was something fishy going on, but even with the few different bits of documented proof, all of that was nothing compared to what would come out the next year. In November 2019, more than 2 full years after the initial game where Danny Farquhar noticed the Astros were up to something, Ken Rosenthal and Evan Drellich published their infamous report on the full extent of what the Astros had been doing. In a detailed story in The Athletic, Rosenthal and Drellich describe a coordinated, multifaceted effort on the behalf of the Astros to not only steal the other team's signs, but to use various members of their playing and non-playing staff, and basically their entire home ballpark, to do so. Very simply, the Astros system worked like this. They would use the live game feed like the one we see on TV to steal the other team's signs. Then, once they decoded them, one or more of their players would relay them to the batter in the box. If you want a lot more detail on how they pulled this off, I'll link a couple of videos devoted specifically to that in the description. But once the report came out, it wasn't even like there was much the Astros could do to deny it. There had been an absolute army of nerds on the internet analyzing video of their players banging on trash cans for months. And one of the guys that Rosenthal and Drellick quoted in their report was Mike Fiers, the Astros' former pitcher, who'd been there when the whole scheme was hatched. See, I told you he'd become important later. After years of teams suspecting that the Astros had been cheating, there was finally substantiated proof that it had happened, and quite a lot of it too. There wasn't much the Astros could realistically do in response, and with the level of anger being directed at them by fans, rival teams, and even MLB itself, the fallout figured to be pretty significant. And it was. Manager AJ Hinch and GM Jeff Luhnow both lost their jobs, and the Astros were forced to give up their first and second round picks for both 2020 and 2021. Alex Cora, who just finished his second year as the manager of the Red Sox, was suspended for an entire year for his role in the scandal as the Astros bench coach. And Carlos Beltrán didn't even make it that far. He'd just been hired as the Mets manager a couple of weeks before the Athletic report came out, but was essentially forced to give that up as he was one of the players most closely linked with the scandal in the first place. It's no exaggeration to say that the Astros sign-stealing scandal was one of the biggest in recent memory. But why was it such a huge deal? They weren't the only team who'd been accused of cheating like that during that same exact time. So why did the Astros end up getting hit so hard? Well, first and foremost, because it worked. Ostensibly, at least. The Astros won the World Series, and from a certain point of view, it's pretty hard not to put two and two together. Team cheats, team wins. Simple as that. They had a competitive advantage that allowed them to win games, and it's precisely because they won those games that their indiscretions become a bigger deal. I do need to point out here that there's not as much evidence that they actually used Operation Codebreaker, which was their dumb name for their sign-stealing operation, during the playoffs in 2017, or even at any time past that, playoffs or regular season. But that may have been because they just got better at it. From the evidence we have, both on video and otherwise, it does seem like their methods of communication evolved. Whether it was hitting a bat rack, whistling, clapping, or the most famous one, banging on a trash can, the Astros seemed down to cheat in whatever way they could, and that's not cool. But the other reason that this was such a big deal is because baseball as an entity is super sensitive to cheating. There's no better example of that than the whole thing with the Mitchell report during the steroid era, and all the congressional hearings that came along with it. If you've forgotten some of the details around that whole dog and pony show, let me lay them out for you again. From both Ken Caminiti's interview with Sports Illustrated in 2002 and Jose Canseco's book Juiced, it was becoming abundantly clear by the mid-2000s that baseball basically had no control over its athletes using PEDs. Like, none at all. So what do we do about this? We get the feds involved. That's right. In 2005, in the middle of the Iraq War, Congress decided to step in and use taxpayer dollars to get testimony from players like Mark McGwire and Rafael Palmeiro on whether or not they used PEDs. If you can't tell, I think this has got to be one of the dumbest moments in the history of American democracy, but still, it happened. And it probably happened because those congresspeople's constituents wanted it to. If nothing else, it demonstrated how far even the highest legislative body in the land was willing to go to protect the sanctity of baseball. Whether it's steroids or using technology to steal signs, corking a bat, or, betting on your own team, cheating is extremely frowned upon in this sport. And yet it's also super common. We call it the steroid era because it lasted for such a long time and there were so many people doing it. Depending on who you ask, steroids were pretty much ubiquitous in baseball from anywhere from 5 or 10 to even 20 years. Last June, we had the whole kerfuffle with umpires starting to check pitchers for foreign substances on their hands and equipment, which has also been going on forever. This is kind of a deep cut, but I remember watching Kenny Rogers pitch with what looked like pine tar in his hand in the 2006 World Series, and that was more than 15 years ago. The Astros are far from the first team to hatch an elaborate scheme to steal signs, going all the way back to people hiding in scoreboards or using telescopes to get the job done. Like I mentioned earlier, they weren't even the only team to get caught doing it that season. The Red Sox got busted for using Apple Watches to tip off their hitters in a series against the Yankees that August. So no, I don't think we should be all that offended by what the Astros did, because, frankly, cheating is about as much a part of baseball's DNA as hot dogs and apple pie. I would say the other thing, but they're not a sponsor, and if you want a name drop on this channel, You gotta earn it. But the Astros cheating should absolutely bother us, because it's a classic example of a psychological phenomenon known as risky shift, where a group agrees to make a more reckless decision than the members of the group would have made individually. Because this thing with the Astros, it wasn't just a couple of rogue coaches or players that made it happen. This was a coordinated effort from multiple different parts of the organization, including the front office. The Wall Street Journal published a story in February 2020 on how the whole process was laid out in a presentation to the team's general manager by an Astros intern. Going back to our discussion of why this was such a big deal, it's because the Astros fed right into one of our biggest morbid fascinations as a country, a conspiracy. America loves a good conspiracy theory, but in 2019, here we were with the real one. This was brazen, over-the-top, organized cheating on a grand scale, and pretty much all of it was corroborated by one of the people who was in the clubhouse when all of it was supposed to be happening. And to pull all of that off, hundreds of individual decisions had to be made over so many weeks and months. Risky shift doesn't dictate that all of them had to be the wrong ones, but it certainly seems like enough of them were. And much more than the transgressions themselves, that shift in decision-making should bother us a lot. To cheat to any degree, but especially to the one that the Astros went to, you have to weigh the risk of getting caught against the potential benefits that cheating would bring you. And an uncomfortable amount of members of the Astros organization said yes to that deal for years. So many people had to decide that the reward was worth people potentially getting fired if they got caught, which they did, and they did. But the risk of doing so was mitigated by the fact that it was in a group setting. And when powerful people decide that that's the route they want to go down, that should really freak us out. Because a risky shift in decision-making is how we end up choosing to go through with something like the Watergate scandal, or the many decisions that led to the housing crisis in 2008. It may have only been about baseball this time, but the Astros showed that the potential for powerful groups to make that kind of choice is still very much alive. We should be upset by what happened with the Astros, but not because what they did was unfair or whatever. I think we've seen over the history of baseball that that sort of thing is way more the norm than the exception, even if this one was particularly bad. So yeah, you know what, Brian Cashman? I'm not buying this whole, the Astros cheated, it wasn't fair, we should have won thing out of you. You know what isn't fair? Garrett Cole and Stanton getting paid as much as the entire Orioles active roster. That's not fair. And you know, I might even go as far as to call it a little horrific. The Astros scandal shouldn't matter to us solely because it's unfair. Unfairness is a part of the structure of the league. It should matter to us because it's another example of accountability and integrity evaporating in a group setting. No matter what the shared goal is, whether it's a World Series, a big payday on the stock market, or even the presidency, you can't just do dumb or irresponsible stuff because there are others around to take the blame if something goes wrong. Groups are made up of individuals, and it takes every one of those individuals retaining their conscience and doing the right thing for the group to do the right thing, no matter the allure or the pressure to do the opposite. In the grand scheme of things, the Astros stealing signs isn't that big of a deal. Even for them, they won the pennant last year and look like they'll be one of the best teams in the league again this year. But they won't be the last group to do something irresponsible. Hopefully for all of us, the cost won't be much more than $5 million and a couple of draft picks. But if we're not careful, it absolutely could be. Phew, man, what a journey that was. I had a lot more to say about this than I thought I would initially, so thank you for everyone staying all the way to the end. Sorry to end it on such a downer, but the whole thing with the Astros kind of lives rent-free in my head, and now I get to share that with all of you. That's the beauty of YouTube, getting to share your neuroses with a group of strangers that you'll probably never meet. But if you like the content, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. We do our best to put out a video every week, and sometimes more if the Lord's willing and the creek don't rise. If you have a suggestion for a video you'd like to see in the future, please drop that in the comments, because I do read those and take your advice. Maybe your suggestion will end up being the next one, but you'll have to come back to find out. Until then, I'm Will. See you later.